Tar and feathers. They join hand in hand, brave Americans all, by uniting we stand, by dividing we fall. The colonists had rejoiced too soon. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts. This placed high taxes on tea, cloth, and other British goods. Americans were furious again. "We won't pay," angry men shouted. "We won't buy anything from Britain." Colonial women refused to wear British cloth or serve tea. Instead, they made rough homespun cloth and drank coffee smuggled in from the Dutch West Indies. Patriotic women swore never to marry a man who bought British goods, and the Sons of Liberty vowed a horrible revenge against anyone who defied the boycott, tar and feathers. They stripped the offender, poured hot tar over him, and then, to make him look ridiculous, emptied a feather pillow over his head. Feathers stuck to the black tar. The screaming man was carried out of town on a wooden rail and dumped in a ditch. Soon, almost no one would buy British goods. The British and Americans were already furious at each other when the American ship, the Liberty, was seized by British customs against agents on a charge of smuggling. The Liberty was owned by John Hancock, a rich Boston merchant who supported the Sons of Liberty. The news spread quickly. Men raced to the docks, a fight broke out, and custom agents were beaten up. The British government was outraged at the news. Parliament voted to send troops to get Americans back under control. In 1768, a squadron of British warships sailed into Boston Harbor. 700 redcoats marched ashore and pitched their tents in Boston Commons. John Hancock, 1737 was when he was born, and he died in 1793. John Hancock was said to be the richest man in Boston. He was also a loyal Sons of Liberty. Even before the Revolutionary War broke out, the British put him on their most wanted list. One young man spoke sneeringly of the colonies at a quilting party. The girls grabbed him, stripped off his shirt, poured molasses over his head, and feathered him with the tips of cattail plants. Being tarred and feathered was a horrible torture. It was feared so much that the Sons of Liberty had only to send a cold ball of tar and feathers to someone in order to just terrify them. He would change his behavior or leave town at once. The finest cloth and needles were made in England. When American women decided to boycott English goods, they held spinning bees. The cloth they made was coarse and unattractive, but they wore it proudly. Since black cloth couldn't be purchased only from Britain, almost everyone stopped wearing black clothes, even to funerals. Instead, a black armband was worn over a person's regular clothes. The Boston Massacre. Lobsters, lobsters for sale. Every time a redcoat walked through the streets of Boston, he heard angry jeers. Sometimes he felt a quick push from behind, and splat, he found himself face down in a pile of garbage. The redcoats began to hate Boston and everyone in it. The townspeople hated them right back. British soldiers infuriated the people of Boston by gambling, drinking, and holding noisy parades on the Sabbath. Finally, on March 5th, 1770, the situation exploded. It was a dark night, cold and snowy. A soldier was standing guard in the sentry box in front of the customs house. A boy came along and began shouting insults at him. The British soldier dashed out of his box and hit the boy with a musket. The boy ran away, crying. But soon he came back with his friends. They threw snowballs at the guard and screaming, "Lousy rascal, bloody back!" A crowd began to gather. The meeting house bell tolled. Men ran through the streets calling, "Town-born, turn out!" This cry was usually raised to call townspeople to help fight a fire. In fact, some people thought there was a fire. They rushed out of their houses carrying buckets of water. Others were ready to fight. They grabbed the fence railings and rocks and ran towards the custom house. The terrified sentry shouted for help. Captain Thomas Preston hurried to his side with 7 other British redcoats. They loaded their muskets, lowered their bayonets, and faced the angry crowd. "Go home," the British Captain Preston yelled. The sentry was only doing his duty. But the Americans' crowd screamed insults at the soldiers and pressed closer. Someone smashed a club across Preston's arm. Rocks flew. Suddenly, a shot rang out. Then another. A man in the crowd dropped down dead. Preston ran among his men, striking up their guns and yelling at them to stop firing. But when the smoke cleared and the crowd withdrew, 3 men lay dead and 2 more were dying. Boston would long remember this terrible night. Crispus Attucks was a tall, strong dockhand. He was part black and part Indian. He and his friends called the redcoats names and threatened them with clubs. Attucks was shot in the chest and killed by Hugh Montgomery, a British private soldier. 2 of the redcoats who had fired on the crowd, Matthew Kilroy and Hugh Montgomery, were found guilty of manslaughter. They were branded on their thumb and dismissed from the British Army. The redcoats and their officers were bombarded with snowballs stuffed with ice or bits of broken oyster shells. Each year after the Boston Massacre, the people of Boston marked its anniversary with prayers for the dead and angry speeches against the British. A large meeting was planned for the 5th anniversary. The British officers decided that they would not tolerate strong speeches against their country. They made a plan. A young British officer was to bring an egg to the meeting. If the speeches were unacceptable, he would throw an egg at a woman in the audience. That would be the signal for the British officers to arrest the colonist leaders. Unfortunately for the British, the young officer fell on his way to the meeting and broke the egg. No one was arrested.